From The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Luke Jones.
I was back in Ukraine for 2 weeks, and one of the people I met was a soldier called Igor. And the reason I came to him was I was looking into the issue of soldiers with PTSD, which he has described to me as a coming tsunami in Ukraine because of, obviously, of the number of people who've been exposed. I think one of the most extraordinary things he told me was that through his experiences, he actually knew what it meant to die. There were 2 moments when that happened for him. The first was that he heard his death announced over military radio by mistake because they'd found this body bag with his name on it, and he had to experience what it's like to hear your colleagues think you've died. And then the second time was after he'd been very badly wounded and he'd been discharged, and he ended up taking part in an experimental session, or I suppose an experiment in general, using a ketamine to treat soldiers with PTSD that was resistant to any other treatment. And it was during his second session, I think. And he said that he, under essentially the psychedelic effect of ketamine, he actually came face to face with the figure of death coming towards him.
So in that session, ketamine session, I met my death. I see it, and then it disappears. And then you see the face, it smiles to you. And then
it was like a classic image of the figure of death with a scythe. But instead of a hooded face, a face appeared, and it was a female face. And he said the face smiled at him. He spoke about that in terms of a ritual with soldiers where you accept your death. You accept the inevitability that you're going to die. And that he says that rather than that being a moment where you give up, it's a moment that you can heal.
As thousands and thousands of Ukrainian soldiers rotate through the front lines, an epidemic of PTSD, as well as physical injuries, is taking hold. The brutal memories of war is rendering some unable to function. But a clinic in Kyiv is trying an unconventional treatment, ketamine-aided therapy.
I mean, the analogy I like to use is that our thoughts are like the wheels of a cart going over ground and gradually digging deeper and deeper and deeper. The ruts get deeper and deeper and deeper. What psychedelics and ketamine do is they shake the ground so it's all level again.
Is this a breakthrough? And if so, why are we not using it here in the UK? A warning, this episode does have vivid descriptions of war and injury that not everyone would want to hear. The story today: can ketamine cure PTSD?
My name is Philp. I am the World Affairs Editor of The Times. I've been covering Ukraine for the last 3.5 years, since just before the invasion. And I've been at The Times for nearly 25 years. And during that time, I have covered quite a lot of conflict.
In fact, one of the first times I think we spoke was when you were in an underground car park in Kyiv at the outset of the full-scale invasion. You're back in Ukraine doing some more reporting. And the aspect that you've been looking at is how to treat people with PTSD, Ukrainians who have been out on the front. How did you get interested in that? Why that?
It's an issue I've always been interested in all of the conflicts I've covered. And I suppose it partly stems from the fact that I have had a PTSD diagnosis myself, which I received in 2006. And that was after sort of 3 years on and off in the Iraq war. And it's an evolving science. I mean, PTSD is something that was known as shell shock in the First World War, and only really was studied as PTSD during the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
But in Ukraine in particular, I mean, I think we're looking at a situation where you've got an awful lot of soldiers who are suffering from PTSD. So this is a really big issue now in Ukraine.
So you met Igor as part of this reporting. What was he like? What did you make of him? And what was his experience of this war after the full-scale invasion?
You know, I was trying to persuade myself, okay, I can manage it. I mean, it can pass. And I mean, I'm strong enough, you know, like this. Yeah.
Familiar.
Warriors do not cry and, you know, bullshit like this.
Yeah. He's a very charismatic man. He's kind of funny, and he has a deep sense of loyalty to his country and to the fact that he'd served before. So, you know, in 2022, when the Russians launched the full-scale invasion, the first thing he did was join up again.
And the very first day, I sent my family out of Kiev to Western Ukraine, to my friends. And by the end of the day, I was at my brigade. So I started right after you know, invasion.
Yeah.
And what did he tell you about his experience in combat?
Yeah, so he's a combat medic. And, you know, I've always been interested in the combat medics because I think they are exposed to, they are particularly vulnerable to this kind of trauma because it springs from kind of survivor guilt. Their job is to save people, and they can't always do that.
I've got a couple of videos from that period.
Often soldiers do this when you're speaking to them about their experience. They'll often have a video, and I think that's just, you know, on their phone, and it's sort of part of the age we live in that you know, it's almost the TikTok war. They've got this stuff on video.
For example, this is a guy that I personally had a deal with. This one, and this is his first aid kit. Yeah, I mean, I was more lucky than him.
The first, actually, it was a still he showed me, or it looked like a still, and it was a guy that he tried to save, and it was a helmet that was completely soaked in blood, and you could see where the bullet had gone in the back of the webbing that comes down the back of the neck, and the bullet had gone in there. So it was just millimeters from being caught by the helmet.
Can you imagine, for example, group of 30 people fighting with 100 of them, of these guys? I mean, that's... Yeah, so we lost in our first combat. During a half a day, we lost 5 guys, including our commander.
And a second video he showed me, and this was a video that was sent to him after he was very badly wounded. It was of the vehicle that he was using to evacuate the wounded from the battlefield, and it was hit by a tank shell whilst he was standing next to it.
They filmed from the trench. This is my car.
Jesus.
Yeah. Okay. I was standing right here.
Wow.
Right here. It is.
And it was so obliterated. And if you just looked at that video, you could see for yourself, like, how did someone standing next to that survive?
And going through all of that must have made his return to quote-unquote civilian life quite difficult.
Yes, I mean, the first injuries that he had, the first things that had to be addressed were his physical injuries. I mean, he lost his hearing for some time. He had some issues with his heart. He had a lot of surgery. And when all that was kind of fixed, the one thing that was left that he couldn't speak.
I had very heavy logomnephrosis, so stuttering. Very heavy stuttering. Well, now you cannot say that.
Before or after?
Yeah, after concussion. Yeah, it was like a third day. I couldn't speak actually.
At all?
Yeah, I was trying something like this.
And as you've hinted at, there will be plenty of people across Ukraine who will find themselves in a similar situation, struggling with PTSD, wanting to find help in this evolving era of medicine. How did he end up at this ketamine-aided therapy?
Yeah, well, firstly, Igor is a very open guy. He's also got this physical manifestation of his trauma, because it's not like they could perform surgery to stop his stuttering. So he knows that's what he's got to fix.
I was trying to find some kind of a way to start speaking. And on Netflix, it is a very, so to speak, bright video about, mushrooms.
He's ranging around looking for things, and of all places, he sees a film on Netflix, and there was a documentary about, I guess, an experimental use of what we would know as magic mushrooms that was being used to help treat people with trauma and get them to open up.
We've all heard really scary things about psychedelics. They scrambled your chromosomes. They caused you to hop off of buildings. It was all terrifying. So I took a look at the true effects of these substances. I was very surprised at what I found.
And in this video, he said, okay, I use psilocybin.
Yeah.
And because he had, stuttering from the very young age and stuff. And I was trying to find something to help myself.
Mescaline, psilocybin, MDMA, LSD.
For a lot of people, this was the bad and evil drugs. But the opposite is true. There are really people who could benefit.
Can't wait to see what's going to happen.
So, but it's prohibited in Ukraine.
Yeah.
This guy that I spoke with in XPO, it was a different subject. I mean, he was trying to find, veterans to work with PTSD and stuff. And then he said, listen, why don't you try ketamine?
And so this clinic he ends up in Kyiv, which does all of this, how did that come about? When did that even start?
Yeah, so that actually opened sometime before the invasion. The use of ketamine for this kind of treatment was legalized in Ukraine in 2017, which is pretty early if you think of it. So yeah, this clinic opened thanks to a Ukrainian doctor who wanted to look into the use of ketamine. And, he went through a lot of battles with the medical and legal establishment in Ukraine to do it. So it is a private clinic, and he got a license to try this out as a therapy. And he was going around looking for veterans with PTSD who were willing to come to him. And that's how he and Igor met each other. And Igor said, yeah, I'm absolutely up for this.
And the therapy itself is what? You're given some ketamine, and then what?
Yeah, so they give you ketamine. It's processed because they don't necessarily know how much you're going to need, what kind of dose you're going to need. So the first session really is sort of establishing that, but the patient is never left alone. There is a therapist with them all the time.
It's not just ketamine, which is healing. The therapy is healing. Ketamine is just the tool.
Yeah. And it was described to me that they're not always guiding them. Sometimes they will allow the patient to kind of go where they need to.
It's very important to have the integration.
Yes.
to not leave the client alone with his, all kind of emotions and all kind of stuff with it.
So it's a talking therapy aided by ketamine, opening up your mind and allowing you to be a bit more flexible with how you think of things.
Absolutely, yes.
How did Eagle find it?
Oh, he said the first session was absolutely awful, and he literally didn't want to ever do it again. So can you describe your first session, like of the taking the ketamine? Like,
Terrible.
It was traumatic. Okay.
Terrible. After the second session, I wasn't sure that I want to continue.
Do it again. He said it wasn't like flashbacks. It was like he was reliving it, but not in exactly the same way.
It's not really flashbacks. Flashbacks, that's you kind of dissociating for a couple of seconds, and then you can return back. Here, you in different reality, absolutely.
Completely immersive.
Yeah, on the ketamine, you're in different reality, absolutely. You are in this reality.
So, for example, someone would come to him who had been killed. So he talked about one soldier, for example, who said, "I'm burning inside. I'm screaming because I'm burning inside." Now, that sounds as awful as it clearly was for him. And yet he felt that it gave him a different understanding. So he'd never been able to speak to some of his comrades who were killed about what happened to them. And during this process, he, as he describes it, literally heard from them.
They said he was screaming, I'm burning inside, before he died. And suddenly this guy appears and I understand why he's saying this.
Was there a moment, though, where it really clicked for Igor and he had some kind of breakthrough with all of this?
Yes, it was during his fourth session.
On the fourth session, I started to speak.
During it or after it?
After it. And I couldn't realize it because the psychotherapist lady, she said, "Igor, do you understand that you speak easily?"
And you didn't know until she said that?
No.
It was the therapist who said to him, "Do you realize you're speaking normally?" And he hadn't even realized it because obviously through this therapy, when he was talking to the therapist, it was still through this really debilitating stutter. And she just said to him, "You're speaking normally."
And then at what point did he feel like he was, are you ever healed from PTSD? Sort of job done, thank you very much, I'm much better now. Did that happen for him?
Yeah, happened within 2 more sessions.
Oh, gosh.
And after fourth session, I started to speak and 2 more sessions. And then I said, no, it's enough. I feel good enough and that's it.
And how did you know it was enough?
I feel it's enough because I feel myself as a part of this world. I feel myself as a part of all these processes, and I feel myself kind of healed.
Catherine, you've been telling us about this unconventional ketamine-aided therapy, which sounds like it's doing wonders for some Ukrainian soldiers who have been suffering from PTSD because of the war. To try and actually understand some of the science behind all of this, you spoke to Dr. David Nutt. Now, people long in the tooth might remember him from being sacked under the last Labour government for, I think it was, he suggested alcohol was more harmful than LSD. That was the hoo-ha at the time, wasn't it? He's a bit of a controversial character in some circles, but how did he come on your radar for this?
Well, I've been following his work for a long time, and this is not a plug for our station. But I'd heard an interview with him on Times Radio with Alexis Conran, where he spoke at great length about, the potential of psychedelics for treatment for PTSD and, went into some of, obviously, his battles with the establishment over this, because he was coming from this position where he was already considered controversial. But he is the pioneer in all of this. So essentially, I just sent him an email saying that I was looking into this. I was about to go and meet all these people in Ukraine. And in fact, it turned out that he had actually come out to Poland and worked with a lot of the Ukrainian pioneers of this. But what was very interesting was, before I even spoke to him, the first thing that he responded to me was, "Yes, please, I'd love to speak to you. And I'd really like to tell you, a UK audience, to hear that Ukraine is so far ahead of us in pioneering this."
And his research in the past has been around, I'm going to say this incorrectly, psilocybin, the drug that's in mushrooms.
It's the active ingredient, yeah.
Not necessarily ketamine, or was this new to him, what they were doing in Ukraine with ketamine itself?
No, he's really tried everything that he's been able to get a license for. I mean, Igor knew of him immediately as like the sort of world expert on ketamine. Now, the reason that it's easier to carry out this research into ketamine is that ketamine is it's a legal drug in a clinical setting. Psilocybin is not. So that's been much harder for them to work with. And also, he's also done some work with microdosing psilocybin for the treatment of depression. And he ran a trial of that at Imperial College. And there was literally a disclaimer when he was calling for patients that he was not allowed to procure the psilocybin for them. They had to, essentially, if you wanted to be part of his study, you had to go and get your own
dose.
Drug. Yeah, you had to go and illegally procure your own drugs because he was not allowed to dispense it. Yeah.
And whether it's psilocybin, whether it's ketamine, any of these kind of hallucinogenic drugs, how did he rationalize and understand why it's useful for potentially treating something like PTSD?
Essentially through his clinical studies, through the fact that he's, carried out these studies.
In that psychedelic state, your brain is some people describe it like shaking out the snow globe. Your brain goes through a period of being very, very much altered. It's a state of massive connectivity in the brain, which allows people to escape from those deeply ingrained thoughts.
There has been work done elsewhere. Like, for example, the US military at a time were trialing MDMA as a treatment for PTSD. Now, they've gone back and forward on that. It has never got out of the trial stage because they reversed a decision that they were going to actually use it as a standard treatment. And so essentially there's a lot of work into like, how do you release what's often buried very deep in people with PTSD, and particularly something called complex PTSD, which tends to be when the PTSD is not related to like a single event, like a sexual assault. Complex PTSD can be quite common in soldiers who are exposed to multiple traumas or prolonged trauma. It can even be someone who's lived with domestic abuse when they've been in fear of their life over a very prolonged period of time. And a lot of these people with this more complex form, they are very difficult to treat, and they don't necessarily respond to antidepressants, which tend to be the first go-to for PTSD.
I mean, the analogy I like to use is that their thoughts are like the wheels of a train. Going over, or the wheels of maybe a cart going over ground, and gradually digging deeper and deeper and deeper. The ruts get deeper and deeper and deeper, because people have depressive thoughts thousands of times a day.
Yeah.
And what psychedelics and ketamine do is they shake the ground so it's all level again.
And there are people like Igor for whom it seems like this has worked fabulously well. But is there are they able to scan anyone and see actually what we did here actually helped in alleviating or treating this PTSD?
Yes, they have.
I mean, that's the most remarkable thing about this research is you can see after people have recovered that their brains are more flexible. You can measure flexibility in the brain by looking at electrical activity and the changes in activity, and that correlates with their recovery.
So what you do like an MRI scan or a brain scan of some kind?
Absolutely.
Right.
So the flexibility data comes from MRI scans. We've done that in 2 separate studies and shown in both studies psilocybin increases flexibility and that correlates with clinical outcome.
Essentially what the brain is doing is it's laying down new neural pathways, and they see electrical activity in the brain, that you see synapses firing off different electrical activity that leads to the formation of these new neural pathways.
We should say it's not just about taking these drugs, it's taking these drugs and then coupling that with some kind of therapy.
That's right, yeah. And this kind of therapy that Igor was describing, obviously, he was kind of reliving things, but experiencing them from in a completely different light that enabled him to reframe his memory. The other thing that can happen under the ketamine therapy is that people can literally recover memories that they have suppressed. So Dr. Nutt had talked about treating a man who was suffering from chronic depression.
I'll give you an example of one of our patients in the first trial. He realised his depression was because he'd been abused by his father. And he kind of repressed that. And a lot of depression is about trying not to think about the trauma, so you think about other things. You consume so much of your brain power that you can't function outside, really. Anyway, so he saw his father abusing him, and he said, I saw what a pathetic man he was. And he said, I realise now why I'm like this. I'm going to tell you to your face how horrible you are. And I've got closure. I don't want to think about you ever again. And he's been well for the last 12 years since he's kind of had that insight.
It sounds like there are all these examples of it working really well, incredibly in some instances, and yet we don't have widespread take-up of this yet. Is there actually any hard data about this working? Is that part of the concern?
I mean, I think that's something that's still ongoing. This is one of the reasons that, Nutt runs so many of these different trials, is so that he can amass the evidence, and the means to collect that evidence, I think, is developing all the time. So again, the kind of brain scanning that we're able to do is advancing all the time. I think that part of the problem, it's a sort of chicken and egg thing. So because a lot of these drugs are considered to be like Class A recreational drugs with no acknowledged clinical use, it becomes very difficult to carry out a large-scale clinical trial. And he described obviously going up against the establishment every single time to try and get these licenses. They're often granted on a smaller scale than would be ideal. And then that is used against, the evidence or the study that is produced. Well, it's not a big enough trial. Well, you haven't permitted a big enough trial. You haven't granted a license. So, it's a chicken and egg situation.
Is that not fair enough when you think about how addictive these drugs are, or how, when especially used in the wrong hands, how destructive they can be? I mean, most of us will have only really heard from ketamine from stories like Matthew Perry's death and things like that. So there are lots of concerns around them, as well as hints that they might be very useful.
There are. I mean, for example, it did occur to me in the context of doing this story that, of course, ketamine was in the news because of Elon Musk. And, and yes, it becomes addictive. This is another objection that is raised to the use of these drugs. Now, if you speak to someone like Igor, and he wasn't the only person I spoke to a young woman who'd taken it as well. And they both said that they had been left with absolutely no desire to take it. And the doctor at XPO who pioneered this, who was the first person in Ukraine ever to to use it, he just said, well, no, because the way that we use these people are reliving some of the worst experiences of their life. They're not going to walk away thinking, oh, that would be fun to do again. It's just not how it works in a clinical setting. No. So, all the people I spoke to in Ukraine, both the clinicians who've used this and the patients who've undergone the therapy, said that this just was not an issue for them.
How long ago was Igor's treatment now, and how does he look back on all of that?
So he finished it about a year ago. When I met him, what was really striking about him was he was so calm and charismatic. And you'd never know this is someone who had suffered this extraordinary sort of kind of a speech impediment. And when he told me that story about, coming face to face with death, my reaction was that just sounds terrifying. And he said it was for a moment,
I see it, and then it disappears, and then you see the face, it smiles to you, and then suddenly I have a thought, okay, it doesn't matter whether it smiles to you. It matters whether you can smile to her.
He suddenly thought, it doesn't matter if she smiles at me. It matters if I can smile back at her. And he did.
So could you smile?
Yeah. So.
And how did that feel?
Relief.
If you have been affected by any of the issues discussed in this podcast, of course, get in touch with your GP. These are not drugs that should be used outside of strict medical supervision, of course. You can find all of Catherine Philp's dispatches from Ukraine at thetimes.com. This episode was produced by Taryn Siegel. The executive producer was Fiona Leach, and sound design and theme composition were by Milo Seto. The story at thetimes.com is how to get in touch with us with any thoughts. I'm Luke Jones. See you soon.